This is section 12.1, part A, Inference for Linear Regression. In chapter 3, we examine data on eruptions of the Old Faithful geyser. The figure below is a scatter plot of the duration and interval of time until the next eruption for all 222 recorded eruptions in a single month. The least squares regression line for this population of data has been added to the graph. It has a slope of 10.36 and a y-intercept of 33.97. We call this the population regression line or the true regression line because it uses all of the observations for that month. Suppose we take a simple random sample of 20 eruptions from the population and calculate the least squares regression line, y hat is equal to a plus bx, for the sample data. How does the slope b of the sample regression line, also called the estimated regression line, relate to the slope of the population regression line? The figures below show the results of taking 3 different simple random samples of 20 Old Faithful eruptions in this month. Each group displays the selected points and the least squares regression line for that sample. So if we look back, remember for the entire population, our slope was 10.36. So if we look at the different samples, our first one has a slope of 10.2, our second one has a slope of 7.7, and our third one has a slope of 9.5. Notice that the slopes of the sample regression lines, 10.2, 7.7, and 9.5, vary quite a bit from the slope of the population regression line of 10.36. The pattern of the variation in the slope B is denoted by its sampling distribution. So if we look at the sampling distribution, remember this is all possible samples of size 20. Here's what the population slope is for our regression line, and then all of our points, this is the approximate sampling distribution, so it's not all of them, shows you the slope of the different regression lines that have a sample size of 20. Confidence intervals and significance tests about the slope of the population regression line are based on the sampling distribution of B, the slope of the sampling regression line. We use Fathom software to simulate choosing 1,000 simple random samples of size 20 from the Old Faithful data. Each time calculating the equation, y hat is equal to a plus bx of the least squares regression line for the sample. The figure below displays the values of the slope b for the 1,000 sample regression lines. We have added a vertical line at the 10.36, which is the actual slope of the population regression line. Let's describe this approximate sampling distribution of B. So if we talk about the shape, we can see that the distribution of B values is roughly symmetric and unimodal. The figure below is a normal probability plot of these sample regression line slopes. The strong linear pattern in the graph tells us that the approximate sampling distribution of B is close to normal. Now, if we talk about the center, the mean of the 1,000 B values is at 10.32. This value is quite close to the slope of the population or true regression line of 10.36. And the standard deviation of the 1,000 B values is 1.31. Later, we will see that the standard deviation of the sampling distribution of B is actually 1.30. So the figure below is a histogram of the B values from the 1,000 simulated simple random samples. We have superimposed the density curve for the normal distribution with the mean of 10.36 and a standard deviation of 1.30. This curve models the approximate sampling distribution of the slope quite well. So as you can see, the curve is what the normal distribution should be if the standard deviation was 1.3 and if the mean of our histogram was 10.36. So it fits that data very well. We can fit a least squares line to any data related to 2 quantity variables, but the results are useful only if the scatter plot shows a linear pattern. Inference about regression requires more detailed conditions. Because the conclusions of inference often concern some population, the conditions describe the population of how the data are produced from it. The slope b and the intercept a of the least squares lines are statistics. That is, we calculate these from the sample data. These statistics would take somewhat different values if we repeated the data production process. To do inference, think about A and B as estimates of unknown parameters, alpha and beta, that describe the population of interest. So when we need to check for regression inference, suppose we have n observations of an explanatory variable x and a response variable y. Our goal is to study or predict the behavior of y given values of x. So first we need to check to see if it's linear. The actual relationship between x and y is linear. For any fixed value of x, the mean response, the mu sub y, falls on the population or true regression line of mu sub y equals alpha plus beta x. The slope beta and the intercept alpha are usually unknown parameters. We need to have independence, so individual observations are independent of each other. It needs to be normal, so for any fixed value x, the response y varies according to a normal distribution. We need to have equal variance, so the standard deviation of y, we're going to call it sigma, is the same for all values of x. The common standard deviation sigma is usually an unknown parameter. And it needs to be random, so the data needs to come from a well-designed random sample or randomized experiment. The figure below shows the regression model when the conditions are met in picture form. The line in the figure is the population regression line, mu sub y is equal to alpha plus beta. For each possible value of the explanatory variable y, the mean of the response, so mu times, which is y given x, moves along the line. The normal curve shows how y will vary when x is held fixed at different values. Along the curves, all of the curves have the same standard deviation sigma, so the variability of y is the same for all values of x. The value of sigma determines whether the points fall close to the population regression line, which means we have a small sigma, or a wide scatter, which means we have a large sigma. So as you can see, we have different equations. And then this is going to cause the curves. And so this is what the mean is of all of them, and that's going to hit right through the middle of all of our curves, our normal distributions. And then our different equations will go to the middle. What does this previous regression model tell us? Consider the population of all eruptions of Old Faithful Geyser in a given year. For each eruption, let x be the duration in minutes and y be the interval of time in minutes until the next eruption. Suppose that the conditions for regression inference are met for this data set, that the population regression line is mu sub y is equal to 34 plus 10.4x, and that the spread around the line is given by sigma is equal to 6. Let's focus on the eruptions that last x equals 2 minutes. For this subpopulation, the average interval of time until the next eruption is mu sub y is equal to 34 plus 10.4 times 2, or 54.8 minutes. The intervals of time until the next eruption follow a normal distribution with a mean of 54.8 minutes and a standard deviation of 6 minutes. For about 95% of these eruptions, the interval of time y until the next eruption between 54.8 minus 2 times sigma is 52.8 minutes, and if we add 2 sigmas, because remember 95% is 2 standard deviations away, we get 66.8. So we can say about 95% of the eruptions will have an interval of time until the next eruption between 52.8 minutes and 66.8 minutes if their eruption time was 2 minutes. So how to check the conditions for regression inference. Linear, so we need to examine the scatter plot to check that the overall pattern is roughly linear, looking for curved patterns in the residual plot. Check to see that the residuals center at the residual of 0 line at each x value for the residual plot. We need to check for independence, so you need to look at how the data were produced. Random sampling and random assignment help ensure the independence of individual observations. If sampling is done without replacement, remember to check the 10% condition. We need to check to see if it's normal, so we need to make a stem plot, a histogram, or a normal probability plot of the residuals and check for clear skewness or other major departures from normality. We need to check for equal variance, so look at the scatter plot of the residuals above and below the residual line equals 0 in the residual plot. The amount of scatter should be roughly the same from the smallest to the largest x values. And we need to check that it's random, so see if the data were produced by random sampling of a randomized experiment. So is there a linear relationship between the height from which a paper helicopter is released and the time it takes to land and hit the ground? A class performed an experiment to investigate this question. Students randomly assigned 14 helicopters to each of 5 height drops. We had 152 centimeters, 203, 254, 307, and 442. Teams of students released the 70 helicopters in a predetermined random order and measured the flight time in seconds. The class used Minitab to carry out a least squares regression analysis for these data. A scatter plot, residual plot, and histogram, and a normal probability plot of the residuals are shown on the next slide. Check whether the conditions for performing inference about the regression model are met. So the first thing we need to check is that it's linear. So the scatter plot, if we come up here and we look at the scatter plot, this would be the first picture is our scatter plot. The scatter plot shows a clear linear form for each drop height used in this experiment. The residuals, so here's our residual plot. The residuals are centered on the horizontal line at 0. The residual plot shows a random scatter about that horizontal line. So for each drop height, you can see that these are about equally scattered around the residual line. Next, we need to check for independence. Because the helicopters were released in a random order and no helicopter was used twice, knowing the results of one observation should give no additional information about another observation. Next, we need to check the normal condition. So the histogram of the residuals is a small peaked, unimodal, and somewhat bell-shaped. In addition, this normal probability plot, which we have over here, is very close to linear. We need to check for equal variance. So the residual plot shows a similar amount of scatter about the residual equals 0 line for all of these. So all of the scatter is about equal for each of these. So we can go ahead and say we have about equal variance. The flight times and the corresponding residuals seem to vary more for the helicopters that were dropped from the 307 height than they were for any of the other ones. So this one is the biggest variance, but the rest are pretty similar. And for random, the helicopters were randomly assigned to 5 possible drop heights. So except for the slight difference in the spread for the 307 drop height, we should be safe performing inference about the regression model in this setting. You will always see some irregularity when you look for normality in a fixed standard deviation in the residuals. especially when you have few observations. Don't overreact to minor violations of the conditions. Inference for regression is not very sensitive to lack of normality, especially when we have many observations. You do need to be cautious. Beware of influential observations. An observation is influential if removing it would remarkably change the results of the statistical calculation, which can greatly affect the results of inference. You will sometimes find that as the response gets larger, so does the scatter of the residuals. You can't trust the results of inference when this happens.